Imagine a man so convinced of his divine authority that he ordered dozens of murders, including his own family members, in the name of God. This is the story of Ervil LeBaron, better known as the Mormon Manson. Leading a breakaway cult from the heart of Mormon fundamentalism, LeBaron built an empire of fear where obedience meant life or death. Over 2 decades, his followers carried out assassinations across 2 countries, all in the name of his twisted version of faith. This is more than just a story of a man gone mad. It's a terrifying glimpse into the dangers of religious extremism taken to the darkest extremes. The LeBaron family's roots run deep in the history of Mormon fundamentalism. Originally followers of the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LeBarons broke away in the early 20th century when the church officially denounced polygamy. The family was part of a splinter group that refused to abandon the practice, seeing it as a sacred commandment. Over time, they became one of the key families in the fundamentalist movement, with several members claiming prophetic authority. In the 1950s, Ervil's brother, Joel LeBaron, co-founded a sect called the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. Based in Mexico, the church held tightly to the practice of plural marriage and other early Mormon doctrines that had long since been abandoned by the mainstream church. However, cracks soon began to form within the LeBaron family itself. Ervil, ambitious and hungry for power, clashed with Joel, ultimately leading to his expulsion from the church. This rift set the stage for Ervil's rise. In 1971, he founded his own group, the Church of the Lamb of God, claiming that he alone was the true prophet. It was here that Ervil's violent and extremist interpretation of Mormonism took hold, as he began to justify murder as a way to eliminate his rivals and consolidate his power. What began as a family rooted in fundamentalist beliefs had now transformed into the foundation for a deadly cult under Ervil's control. Ervil LeBaron's hunger for power led to a bitter split from his brother Joel's sect, a turning point that would mark the beginning of his violent rise to leadership. After being excommunicated from Joel's Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times, Ervil refused to step aside quietly. Instead, he declared himself the true prophet, believing that his divine authority surpassed that of his brother and anyone else who opposed him. In 1971, Ervil founded his own group, the Church of the Lamb of God, attracting a loyal following of people who were drawn to his charismatic yet dangerous leadership. What set Ervil apart was his twisted interpretation of an abandoned Mormon belief, the doctrine of blood atonement. This doctrine, never officially adopted by the mainstream church, suggested that some sins were so severe that the only way for a person to find redemption was through their own blood being shed. Ervil used this belief as a justification for murder, claiming that killing his enemies wasn't just an act of self-preservation, it was a divine command. He convinced his followers that anyone who opposed him, including members of his own family and other religious leaders, needed to be eliminated to cleanse their souls and protect the future of his church. This deadly interpretation of faith would become the cornerstone of Ervil's violent campaign, as he led his followers into a brutal era of bloodshed in the name of God. In August of 1972, Ervil LeBaron's violent ambition reached a deadly turning point with the murder of his brother Joel, the leader of their family's original sect. The brothers had long been locked in a bitter power struggle, with Joel rejecting Ervil's claim to prophetic authority. For Ervil, this was more than just a family feud, it was a matter of divine will. In his mind, Joel's refusal to submit was a betrayal that demanded the ultimate punishment. Ervil ordered his loyal followers to carry out the hit on Joel, and they obeyed without question. On a summer day in Baja California, two of Ervil's men tracked Joel down at a secluded home. There, they brutally beat him before shooting him to death, marking the first murder in what would become a long and bloody campaign. Joel's murder sent shockwaves through the polygamous community and signaled to everyone that Ervil was willing to go to any lengths to establish his dominance. What began as a quest for religious power had now escalated into a reign of terror where no one, even family, was safe from Ervil's wrath. This was just the beginning of a series of killings that would follow in the years to come as Ervil solidified his role as a deadly cult leader. Ervil LeBaron wielded the doctrine of blood atonement like a weapon, twisting it into a justification for murder and domination. Originally a disused concept from early Mormon teachings, blood atonement was the idea that some sins were so grievous that only the shedding of the sinner's blood could redeem them. Although never officially accepted by the mainstream Mormon church, Ervil seized upon this belief and manipulated it to serve his deadly agenda. In Ervil's eyes, anyone who stood in his way was guilty of such severe sin that they deserved to die not just for defying him, but to cleanse their souls. He preached that by ordering these executions, he was carrying out God's will, making himself not only the judge but also the executioner. This warped interpretation of faith became the foundation of his teachings, allowing him to command his followers to murder without hesitation. Ervil's psychological control over his followers was profound. Through a combination of fear, charisma, and religious manipulation, he convinced them that killing was not only necessary but righteous. His followers believed that by carrying out these murders, they were saving their victims' souls and securing their own places in heaven. Any doubts they had were overridden by the fear of their own blood being shed if they failed to obey. This doctrine of blood atonement became a cornerstone of Ervil's reign of terror, allowing him to orchestrate dozens of murders over the years, all in the name of salvation. His grip on his followers' minds turned them into instruments of violence, willing to kill at his command under the belief that they were serving a higher purpose. As Ervil LeBaron's cult expanded, so did his obsession with eliminating anyone who posed a threat to his authority. His list of enemies grew relentlessly, encompassing not only rival religious leaders but also members of his own family who dared to defy him. Driven by his belief in divine authority and blood atonement, Ervil's reach of violence stretched far beyond his immediate circle, terrorizing the polygamous communities in both Mexico and the United States. Ervil's first major target had been his brother Joel, but Joel was only the beginning. Following his murder, Ervil set his sights on other rival leaders who refused to recognize him as the true prophet. One of the most infamous murders he ordered was that of Dr. Rouleau Allred, a respected polygamous leader in Utah. In 1977, Ervil sent two of his wives, disguised in wigs, to assassinate Allred in broad daylight. This brutal act shocked the Mormon fundamentalist world and showcased the lengths to which Ervil was willing to go to assert his dominance. But Ervil's ruthlessness wasn't limited to outside threats. As his paranoia deepened, he began targeting members of his own family, including his wives and children. Any sign of disloyalty or dissent was met with lethal consequences. His doctrine of blood atonement allowed him to justify these killings as acts of divine retribution. Disobedience was seen as treason against God, and in Ervil's mind, the only way to atone for such a sin was through death. Over the years, Ervil orchestrated dozens of murders, turning his followers into instruments of death. With each new enemy added to the list, his cult became a deadly machine fueled by religious fanaticism and his unrelenting quest for power. This expanding kill list would leave a trail of bloodshed and destruction that echoed long after Ervil's death. In May of 1977, Ervil LeBaron's cult carried out one of its most notorious and high-profile murders, the assassination of Dr. Rouleau Allred. Allred was a respected leader of a rival polygamous group known as the Apostolic United Brethren, and he posed a significant threat to Ervil's claim of prophetic authority. Allred's refusal to acknowledge Ervil as the true prophet made him a prime target in Ervil's ever-growing kill list. Determined to eliminate his rival, Ervil ordered the hit with chilling precision. He sent two of his wives, Rena Chynoweth and another woman, to Allred's clinic in Murray, Utah. Disguised in wigs and heavy makeup, the women calmly walked into the clinic during the middle of the day. Without hesitation, they entered Allred's examination room and shot him multiple times, killing him in cold blood as patients and staff looked on in horror. The murder of Dr. Allred was a turning point for Ervil's cult, bringing national attention to the Church of the Lamb of God and its violent methods. Allred was not just a religious leader, he was a public figure with multiple wives and nearly 50 children, which made the crime even more shocking to the public. Media outlets quickly picked up the story, and Ervil LeBaron's name became synonymous with the bloodshed carried out in the name of his twisted beliefs. The investigation that followed linked the murder directly to Ervil's orders, with the two women fleeing the scene and later being identified as members of his cult. The killing not only intensified law enforcement's focus on Ervil, but also sent waves of fear through the polygamous community, as people realized that no one, no matter how powerful, was safe from his reach. This brazen act of violence solidified Ervil's reputation as a cult leader who would stop at nothing to eliminate his enemies. Even after the high-profile murder of Dr. Rulon Allred, Ervil LeBaron managed to evade capture for several years, continuing his reign of terror from various hideouts across the US and Mexico. His ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement only fueled his sense of invincibility, and from the shadows he continued to orchestrate more killings, determined to eliminate anyone who opposed him. Operating like a fugitive, Ervil moved frequently, relying on his loyal followers to provide him with shelter and protection. From these safe houses, he maintained tight control over his cult, issuing orders for new murders as his paranoia grew. One of his next major targets was Robert Simons, a rival cult leader who had dared to challenge Ervil's authority. Simons led a small polygamous group and had written to Ervil questioning his teachings and spiritual legitimacy. In retaliation, Ervil ordered two of his followers to take Simons out to the desert, where they brutally murdered him. Simons was shot, his body doused in lime, and buried in a shallow grave. This methodical elimination of rivals became a hallmark of Ervil's leadership, as he viewed any dissent as a threat to his divine authority. Despite law enforcement closing in, Ervil's network of followers and his ability to blend into the remote regions of Mexico and the American Southwest allowed him to continue evading arrest. During this time, he ordered the deaths of numerous individuals, including disloyal cult members and even some of his own family. His growing kill list and ability to stay on the run only deepened the fear surrounding him, cementing his legacy as a violent, untouchable cult leader. Each murder pushed his cult further into darkness, with Ervil's commands now extending beyond mere survival. He sought to eliminate anyone who even remotely questioned his control. Law enforcement agencies, spread thin across two countries, struggled to bring him to justice, allowing Ervil to continue his deadly campaign. As Ervil LeBaron continued to evade capture, his ability to stay on the run depended heavily on the loyalty and support of his devoted followers. These individuals, completely consumed by Ervil's twisted doctrine, provided him with shelter, resources, and protection as he moved between various hideouts across the US and Mexico. His followers believed they were aiding a prophet chosen by God, and they would go to extreme lengths to ensure his safety and continue his deadly mission. Ervil's control over his cult was maintained through a combination of fear and manipulation. He used his doctrine of blood atonement as a tool to keep his followers obedient, constantly reminding them that disloyalty would lead to their own deaths. This psychological stranglehold ensured that even as he moved from one location to another, he never lost his grip on the cult. Punishing dissenters was a key part of how Ervil maintained power. Any sign of disobedience or questioning of his authority was met with severe consequences. Ervil did not hesitate to order the murder of anyone he perceived as a threat, including his own family members. His wives, children, and close relatives were not immune to his wrath. If they expressed doubt or tried to escape, they were swiftly dealt with. Some were killed, while others lived in constant fear that they might be next. This atmosphere of terror kept the cult tightly bound to Ervil even as he became more elusive. His followers were too frightened to turn against him, knowing that doing so could result in their own execution. Ervil's ability to manipulate those around him, coupled with his followers' blind devotion, allowed him to continue orchestrating murders and evading the authorities. Even in hiding, he ruled with an iron fist, maintaining absolute control over his deadly network through sheer fear. In 1979, after years of evading capture and orchestrating murders from the shadows, Ervil LeBaron's luck finally ran out. Mexican authorities, in coordination with us law enforcement, managed to track him down in Lerdo, Mexico. His years of manipulating and controlling his followers had come to an end as he was apprehended and extradited to the United States to face justice for his crimes. The arrest was a significant breakthrough for law enforcement who had been struggling to put an end to Ervil's reign of terror. Upon his extradition, Ervil was swiftly put on trial for his involvement in the murder of Dr. Rulon Allred. The evidence against him was overwhelming: witness testimonies, connections to his followers who had carried out the killing, and his blatant use of religious doctrine to justify the crime. In court, Ervil remained defiant, showing no remorse for the murders he had ordered. His belief in his divine authority remained unshaken, and he continued to view himself as a prophet, even as the walls of justice closed in. However, the jury saw through his manipulations, and he was convicted of ordering the assassination of Allred. In 1980, Ervil was sentenced to life in prison, marking the end of his murderous campaign. While his imprisonment brought a sense of relief to those who had lived in fear of his cult, the story of Ervil LeBaron was far from over. Even behind bars, his influence persisted, with followers still carrying out his orders and killings that would continue long after his conviction. Nonetheless, the capture of Ervil LeBaron was a crucial victory, bringing to a close one of the darkest chapters in the history of Mormon fundamentalist violence. Even after Ervil LeBaron was locked away in prison, his control over his cult remained terrifyingly intact. From behind bars, Ervil continued to manipulate and direct his followers to carry out murders on his behalf. Before his capture, he had left behind a chilling document known as the Book of the New Covenants, a manifesto that contained a hit list of people he deemed enemies of his faith. This written order became a blueprint for violence, and his most loyal followers, still gripped by fear and devotion, obeyed his commands without question. The murders orchestrated from prison were no less brutal than those carried out during Ervil's years on the run. His followers targeted former members who had left the cult, rival sect leaders, and even family members who had fallen out of favor. One of the most horrific examples was the murder of three of his own children in the early 1980s. These killings were carried out in accordance with Ervil's written instructions, proving that his reach extended far beyond the prison walls. The violence continued for years after his death in 1981, as his hit list remained active. In what became known as the 4 o'clock murders in 1988, several members of the LeBaron family were killed almost simultaneously as part of an orchestrated effort to eliminate perceived traitors. The sheer brutality of these killings demonstrated the lasting psychological and spiritual grip Ervil had over his followers. The aftermath of Ervil LeBaron's leadership left a bloody legacy that would haunt his family and the fundamentalist communities for years. His cult, driven by the belief that they were carrying out God's will, became a symbol of how religious extremism, fueled by fear and fanaticism, could continue to inflict terror long after the leader's death. The impact of these murders reverberated through the polygamous community, serving as a grim reminder of the dangerous power one man could wield, even from beyond the grave. Ervil LeBaron's death in 1981, found lifeless in his prison cell at the age of 56, may have seemed like the end of his brutal reign, but it was far from the close of the violent chapter he had written. His influence continued to loom large over his followers thanks to the chilling hit list he had left behind in his manifesto, the Book of the New Covenants. This document outlined the names of people he deemed traitors, enemies, or threats to his divine mission, and it continued to serve as a guide for his followers even after his death. The death of a cult leader often brings about the collapse of the group, but in Ervil's case, his followers were so deeply indoctrinated that they carried on his mission of bloodshed. Still loyal to his teachings and fearing the repercussions of disobedience, they believed that failing to carry out the remaining killings would result in their own deaths or eternal damnation. The hit list wasn't just a directive, it was, in their minds, a divine order. In the years following Ervil's death, his followers continued to execute murders based on this list. One of the most notorious examples was the 4 o'clock murders in 1988, where several former members of the cult were killed almost simultaneously in a coordinated attack. These killings were part of a broader plan to eliminate anyone who had abandoned the group or turned against Ervil's teachings. The persistence of these murders, even after the cult's leader was long gone, showcased the terrifying grip Ervil had over his followers. His legacy of violence didn't die with him. Instead, it was passed down through generations of indoctrinated believers. The cycle of fear and fanaticism continued, and the impact of his leadership was felt far beyond his prison cell, with the cult's violence continuing to claim lives in his name. The story of Ervil LeBaron is a chilling reminder of how deeply entrenched extremist beliefs can become and how, even in death, a cult leader's influence can drive followers to commit unspeakable acts of violence. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the LeBaron cult's power began to unravel. As law enforcement intensified their efforts and the weight of the cult's atrocities came to light, the group's once tight-knit structure began to fracture. Many of Ervil LeBaron's most loyal followers, fearing arrest or retribution from within the group, either fled or turned against the cult's leadership. The fallout from years of violence and control started to catch up with the remaining members. Several key arrests and trials marked the downfall of the LeBaron cult. In the years following Ervil's death, law enforcement zeroed in on his inner circle, particularly those who had been involved in carrying out his murderous commands. One of the most significant trials was that of Rinat Chinoweth, one of Ervil's wives, who had been involved in the 1977 assassination of Dr. Roulon Olred. Although Rina was acquitted in her criminal trial, she was later found liable in a civil suit and ordered to pay millions in damages to the Allred family. Another key figure, Ervil's daughter, Jacqueline Tarsa LeBaron, was arrested in the early 1990s for her involvement in the infamous 4 o'clock murders of 1988, in which several former cult members were killed in coordinated attacks. Jacqueline, along with other cult members, was convicted of conspiracy and murder. This event marked a turning point in the cult's decline, as many of its members faced life sentences or were driven into hiding. As more of Ervil's followers were brought to justice, the cult's influence weakened. The fear that had once held the group together began to dissipate, and those who had once been deeply devoted to Ervil's vision started to question the legitimacy of his teachings. Many former members went on to speak out against the cult, revealing the horrific extent of its violence and manipulation. By the 1990s, the LeBaron cult had largely disbanded, with its remaining members scattered and leaderless. Trials and convictions had dismantled the network of killers that Ervil had left behind, and the group's ability to carry out further violence was significantly diminished. The downfall of the LeBaron cult was a slow but inevitable collapse, as the weight of its crimes finally caught up with those who had once been at its core. The survivors of the LeBaron cult, particularly Ervil's own children, faced an uphill battle to rebuild their lives after escaping the violent grip of their father's teachings. Growing up in an environment where murder was justified as divine will left deep psychological scars on those who managed to break free. Many of Ervil's children and former cult members fled the group as it began to disintegrate, but the trauma of their upbringing haunted them long after they escaped. One of the most vocal survivors is Anna LeBaron, one of Ervil's many children who escaped the cult at the age of 13. In her memoir, she describes the constant fear, manipulation, and isolation she experienced as a child in the cult. Life for Ervil's children was marked by strict obedience, religious indoctrination, and the looming threat of violence. Those who dared to question the teachings or sought to leave risked their own lives, knowing that Ervil's doctrine of blood atonement extended even to family members. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. Many of them grew up with conflicting emotions, love for their family, and deep fear of the consequences of disobedience. Some struggled with feelings of guilt for having been a part of such a violent group, while others faced isolation and difficulty adjusting to life outside the cult. Ervil's teachings had been so deeply ingrained in their minds that breaking free was not just a physical escape, but a mental one as well. For those who managed to leave, the path to healing was long and complicated. Some sought therapy and support from others who had experienced similar cult environments, while others remained silent, choosing to distance themselves from the trauma. Many survivors have since shared their stories publicly, shedding light on the horrors of life inside the cult and helping others understand the psychological control that such groups can exert. Rebuilding their lives meant not only creating new identities outside of the cult, but also dealing with the public association with their father's crimes. Despite the challenges, many of Ervil's children and former followers have worked to move past the violence of their upbringing, finding ways to heal and reclaim their lives. Their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable trauma. The story of Ervil LeBaron is one that echoes far beyond his death, a chilling reminder of the devastating power that religious fanaticism and manipulation can hold over people. His reign of terror, which spanned decades and claimed the lives of numerous victims, serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the manipulation of faith for personal gain. Ervil's twisted interpretation of religious doctrine, combined with his relentless pursuit of control, turned his followers into instruments of violence, capable of committing atrocities in the name of salvation. Even after his death, the murders continued proof of how deeply entrenched his teachings had become in the minds of his followers. The bloodshed, fear, and trauma that followed in his wake have left a permanent scar on those who survived and the communities he terrorized. His story is not just one of a cult leader, but of how belief, when twisted into a weapon, can become deadly. The legacy of Ervil LeBaron remains a cautionary tale of the dark side of human nature, where power, fear, and manipulation can spiral into violence and destruction. It is a story that reminds us of the importance of questioning authority, especially when it is cloaked in the guise of divine will. If there's one thing we can learn from the tragic story of the LeBaron cult, it's that blind faith and unquestioning loyalty to a charismatic leader can lead to devastating consequences. The scars left by Ervil LeBaron's reign of terror will never fully heal, but by remembering his story, we can work to prevent such horrors from happening again. For more in-depth stories like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more true crime insights that dig deep into the darkest corners of human behavior.